Bueno, gracias Helen, gracias Ian y Tom por la invitación a la conferencia. Yo voy a hablar en inglés, pero después si quieren podemos hablar en español por si tienen alguna duda o algo así. I imagine some of you are familiar with control risks, as I know some of our clients are here, but maybe you're not aware of the full suite of services that control risk provides. So just give and possibly not aware of our political risk analysis team. So I'll just give you a brief overview. It'll be very short. No slides on that one, so very quick. Control risk helps companies, including mining companies, but not exclusively, in addressing three kinds of risks. Security risks, corruption risks, and political risk. So by security risk, we address, let's say, the security of a particular plant or a mining site or an office, security of personnel, and security of information, particularly in light of growing cyber threat crimes and activism. On the corruption risk front, we support companies in pre- and post-transaction support, both through due diligence, background checks, vetting, maybe fraud investigations, or even more actively supporting the company in building up a range of policies on the compliance space. And the political risk analysis team will support companies in understanding and mapping the key political trends across the globe. This is, after all, a global company, has offices in 30 countries, more than 30 countries worldwide. And in addition to that, we can look both at the national level, but also at the regional level, or maybe around a very specific project. I guess that's very tailored to the mining sector, where you often, in relatively isolated areas where there isn't that much information available on the main stakeholders around. We often tie that up with social risk consulting, understanding the key stakeholders around a specific project and mapping their interests and potential attitudes towards a particular project. And we also support companies in mapping corruption risks. I guess that's increasingly important in light of the growing FCPA and UK Bribery Act enforcement. The enforcement of these anti-corruption legislations, they are global in nature, but also growing enforcement, I guess, even within regions. You think Latin America, Chile, Brazil, Panama, just to give three examples of growing anti-corruption enforcement that are probably worth bearing in mind. Today I'm going to talk specifically about Argentina and this the situation, the political situation that we're facing, pretty much the end of an era, right? I think after 12 years in power, we'll see the Kirchner departing from power. And I'll start off just with a brief overview. I guess there's not much need to go into great lengths on this. You're probably very familiar with the situation in Argentina. Situation where consistently high inflation rates since 2007, pretty much, and lots of question marks about the official statistics that are published. Low levels of international reserves. You see that on the headlines of Argentina on a daily basis, partially because they are at critically low level. The government has bought some time with the currency swap with China last year, but that is a sort of a temporary fix. There's wider structural problems still in place. You have currency controls, the so-called cepo cambiario, and obviously the huge credit issues regarding the country's lack of ability to gain access to international financial markets and actually being in technical default since the Griesa ruling in June 2014, which was later enforced in August of that same year. Also, it's an economy where there's high levels of state intervention. We have seen, selective nationalizations, YPF, Aerolíneas, the pension funds, a range of nationalizations in the transport sector as well. I guess a lot of protectionist measures. Argentina is certainly one of the most protectionist countries in the world nowadays, and it's very difficult to get access to imports. There are also attempts to freeze prices or control prices in light of the inflation. As I mentioned, the currency controls, it's hard to get to purchase dollars in Argentina, and there are severe restrictions on the repatriation of profits. And last but not least, there are corruption risks. Obviously, this is a wider trend. This is not something new to Argentina. But I guess what I would highlight in particular that I think will be a sort of a cursed legacy of the Kirchner's administration is the efforts to curb the independence of anti-corruption institutions. So the general audit or the anti-corruption office have been sort of co-opted by government allies, and they haven't been able to do a proper job in actually scrutinizing not only government finances but government contracts as well. And specifically with regards to the mining sector, I guess we saw sort of a game changer in 2011. Why is that? Because before that, the sector had been relatively spared from some of the more draconian policies by the government, and the decision in late 2011 to extend the restrictions on repatriation of profits to the mining companies, I think there was a sort of a game changer, as I mentioned. And since then, there have been a series of other policies specific to the mining sector that have been harmful. I guess the situation regarding the protectionism and imports is probably one of the most critical. Companies have been asked to create import substitution departments internally to develop an import substitution plan. They have to ask for permission in advance in order to import, but they have, let's say, severe incentives, to put it that way, to substitute whatever they were importing with local let's say local equivalents, even if they are not at the same quality or maybe at the same price as their international competitor, but they do not have much of a choice. And I guess also the broader macroeconomic, let's say, imbalances are also affecting the mining sector. I guess the overvalued exchange rate being, a key concern, for example. Now, what we are seeing in Argentina is a pretty competitive elections, where we just came out of the results from the party primaries, the PASO, on Sunday. And unsurprisingly, the candidate of the ruling party, the Frente para la Victoria, Daniel Scioli, fared pretty well. But he was closely followed by Mauricio Macri, the Buenos Aires mayor, who's from the opposition, center-right opposition, Propuesta Republicana, and also a surprising result by the third candidate, Sergio Massa, who was an ally of the Kirchners. He was Cristina Fernandez's cabinet chief, but later switched the opposition, is now leading a dissident faction of the Peronists. Now, according to Argentine constitution, a presidential candidate needs 45% of the votes in order to win the election in the first round, or he can win over 40 percentage points, but with a 10-point margin over the second best candidate. Currently, this is not the scenario. As you see earlier, the difference is 38-30. And we believe that that's likely to continue. We think the elections will remain competitive and will probably go to a second round runoff vote. And I think that's has an interesting effect. And this is, I guess, one of the key messages that I'd like to address here is the fact that the second round runoff has a sort of a centralizing effect, because in order to win a second round runoff, you probably need to move away from your political base in order to let's say, cater to a broader audience, a broader constituency, and win, over 50% of the vote. So this tends to bring both candidates closer to the political center, and I think this is already what we are seeing in Argentina, just with the prospects of a ballotage. We are seeing Macri making comments regarding the fact that he's not going to privatize YPF, or Scioli saying that he's actually thinking of changing some policies, though not everything. But again, it's difficult to ignore the fact that Scioli does have a sort of a winning edge, and it remains the front runner. And I think so. Just I wanted to delve into some of the particularities of his candidacy. I guess there were a lot of eyebrows raised when he chose his vice president, Carlos Zanini, who everyone knows as a core member of the Kirchner, let's say, close circle of advisors. He's currently her legal secretary. And he also, throughout his campaign, has made quite flattering comments to the Peronist youth. La Cámpora has made very few criticism to the current economic policy, even though there's obviously a lot of concern about that. And that obviously conflicts with his position as a sort of a more centrist political figure, more pragmatic, and even his track record in Buenos Aires province, which it's not particularly great, but it does have, let's say, a bit more fiscal discipline than the national government. But obviously he just came from a party primaries where he had to secure the support of the hardcore Kirchneristas. And obviously he's in a situation where he has to balance those two interests, and I guess that's why we are seeing, these mixed messages. But all in all, we do believe that, he will sort of move away from, the same old economic policies and actually implement a more pragmatic, moderate administration once he is in power. And one thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is actually how could he do that? Because I think nowadays, looking at the political situation in Argentina, it's very easy to perceive, let's say, Cristina as having or casting a long shadow, that goes beyond her mandate. But I guess there's a lot of ways if Scioli wanted to, let's say, create his own support base and draft a path that is somewhat different from Cristina's, he could. And that's the fact that Argentina has a pretty powerful presidency. I guess presidencies are or can be very powerful in Latin America, but particularly in Argentina. You have, let's say, tools such as the composition of the cabinet, appointment of ministers, the appointment of positions within the state bureaucracy, but there's also one key element of Argentina, which is fiscal federalism. So just to paint with a broad brush here, the central government, the national government, collects most taxes. Let's say around 3/3 of taxes are collected by the national government. But when it comes to spending, it's actually split 50-50 between national and regional governments. So the regional governments, they rely on transfers from the national government in order to pay even basic expenditures such as payroll, pay their public sector employees. So they're really dependent on national government. It's very difficult for them to oppose the national government. So obviously that creates avenues for whoever is on the presidency to win the support of the provincial governors and so forth, their political movements. There are also a few other tricks or tools, whatever you want to call it. For example, the underestimation of budget. Basically, you claim that your fiscal revenues will only go up by a certain percent, but once they come above that threshold, you have an additional fiscal revenues which you can distribute more freely, in a more discretionary way. And last but not least, presidential decrees, which have been used, throughout Cristina's, Nestor, even Menem's presidency, are also a good way of, let's say, overcoming congressional minorities, for example. And so I guess regardless of who secures power in October or November, will most likely be more market-friendly than the current government. We'll have to make some economic adjustments. We'll probably have to strike a deal with Argentina's holdout creditors. That's probably the last frontier until Argentina can reach out to international financial markets again, and being able to issue debt would significantly improve the government's ability to implement those economic adjustments, cut back subsidies, and so forth. But one key feature that is coming out from the PASO primary is that most likely none of the political forces will have a majority in the Chamber of Deputies. The Frente para la Victoria most likely have a majority in Senate, but not exactly in the Chamber of Deputies. And but I guess there are other issues at stake in the October elections that I wanted to raise, and one of them being regional elections. So again, in Argentina's federal system, provinces, they actually have a significant authority over mining projects, and they are responsible for issuing mining licenses. They are responsible for environmental policy, labor standards, questions related to royalties. So for mining companies, provincial elections should be, of equal, if not more, importance. And I think this is something that companies willing to invest in Argentina should have keep an eye on. And especially because we have seen a historically receptiveness to mining can be quite different. Some provinces such as Catamarca, San Juan, and I guess to some degree some other ones, maybe Salta, are relatively mining-friendly, whereas La Pampa, Mendoza have actually much harsher environmental laws and are much stricter with regards to mining, a bit of a more difficult operational environment for companies. And another issue that's worth bearing in mind is that over the last decade there has been a proliferation of these provincially owned mining companies, which have they don't necessarily operate mines or engage in even exploration activities, but they mostly make joint ventures with private companies, or private companies are politely invited to make joint ventures with them. This is something also worth highlighting. And just to touch on briefly on some of the social issues that we have seen, I guess there's a broader trend here that the mining sector is not really immune, though not necessarily the most affected, which is a sort of growing trend of labor unrest. We have seen several general strikes throughout Argentina, and there are a few drivers there. Obviously, inflation denting the workers' purchasing power. You also have the disputes regarding the threshold for income tax, el impuesto a las ganancias, and even with divisions within the political movement between unions that support the current governments and unions that are against them, and what impact that will have. What impact the elections will have on that, I guess, remains to be seen. I guess there is a sort of an attempt by Scioli to reunite some of the larger umbrella unions, such as the CGT, but to an extent he will be able to do that, unless he addresses issues such as ganancias, and la inflación remains to be seen. And another issue that, I guess this is a whole different presentation on its own, but I just wanted to put it out there, as a consideration that, socioeconomic conflicts are a reality in Argentina. There have been a few cases of companies being forced to leave or forced to abandon their mining projects due to community opposition. And I guess there are a few issues there that the government needs to address. in order to improve that, because a lot of those issues come out of weak institutions, especially because, as I mentioned, a lot of these issues are managed by provincial governments, and maybe, you know, the environmental secretary in these provinces is not actually, you know, a technically sound and a truly independent body from government. It has obviously other interests at stake, and that takes a lot of autonomy of those bodies, and companies end up in and if you add that the fact that the judiciary is often politicized as well, you have a situation in which companies often find very difficult to find a middle ground with, let's say, community and environmental opposition to their projects, because there's not really someone who can say, you know, oh, this and that particular concern are actually true, and, you know, let's see how we can address and mitigate, or maybe this and that concern aren't really valid, that's a bit of a stretch, you know, let's stop here. There really isn't someone who is seen by both parties as truly independent with enough political power to separate, you know, what is valid and what is not. Part of that comes, as I mentioned, because of weak institutions, the fact that these provincial bodies aren't as developed, and there is also an issue of a lack of a national framework. There is a Ley General de Medio Ambiente, but in practice, it doesn't work as it should in terms of being a national framework for environmental legislation. So you see huge disparities between environmental standards between provinces, and you have some provinces being quite draconian, for example, banning open pit mining altogether, whereas others have, you know, much more balanced legislation. And again, that remains to be seen in terms of how the government will address that. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that much debate between candidates on what exactly they expect for the mining sector. One thing that I guess all of them mentioned is that mining is going to play an important role in Argentina's recovery. You know, together with agriculture, together with energy, most likely, obviously, vaca muerta, but not only, will be sort of the key three main drivers of Argentina's economic recovery. So it remains to be seen to an extent that we'll be able to address some of these issues that we mentioned in order to fully unleash Argentina's potential on this particular sector. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take those after my fellows finish their presentations. Thank you. Gracias.